Book 3, 49 to 48 BC. Preparations for the Illyrian campaign. As dictator, I presided over the elections in Rome. The consuls elected were Publius Servilius and myself. It was in this year that I was legally eligible for the office. I found that throughout Italy credit was becoming restricted, and debts were not being paid, and so I decided to appoint assessors to make a valuation of real and personal property on a pre-war basis, so that creditors should be paid accordingly. This seemed to be the most appropriate means for removing or diminishing the fear of a general cancellation of debts, a fear which is very often felt in periods of war and civil disturbances, and also for maintaining credit. Next, by encouraging praetors and tribunes to bring bills before the People's Assembly, I restored their rights to a number of people who under Pompey's law had been condemned for bribery at elections. These convictions had been secured at the time that Pompey had garrisoned his legions in Rome, and the trials had never taken up more than 1 day, with one panel of judges hearing the evidence and another passing sentence. The victims of these sentences had, from the beginning of the Civil War, offered me their services if I wished to make use of them, and since they had put themselves at my disposal in this way, I regarded them just as I would have if they had actually performed these services. I had decided that they should have their rights restored to them by a vote of the People's Assembly, rather than by what would look like an act of grace on my part, for I did not want to seem ungrateful when it came to paying back a kindness, nor did I want to appear arrogant in anticipating the right of the People's Assembly to confer favors. I gave 11 days to the carrying out of these measures, to the celebration of the Latin festival and the holding of elections. I then resigned the dictatorship, left Rome, and went to Brindisi, where 12 legions and all the cavalry had been ordered to assemble. However, I found that the ships available would allow, at the utmost, only the transport of 15,000 legionaries and 500 cavalry. This lack of shipping was the one thing that prevented me from finishing the war quickly, and even the forces which did embark were below strength. Many men were missing after all the campaigns in Gaul. The long march from Spain had diminished numbers considerably, and the whole army had suffered in fitness as a result of the unhealthy autumn weather in Apulia and around Brindisi after the bracing climates of Gaul and Spain. Pompey had had a year in which to build up his strength. During this time he had had no fighting to do, and no enemy had approached him. Thus he had got together a large fleet from Asia and the Cyclades, Corfu, Athens, Pontus, Bithynia, Syria, Cilicia, Phoenicia, and Egypt. He had ordered still more ships to be built wherever this could be done. He had raised large sums of money from Asia and Syria, from all the kings, dynasts, and tetrarchs, and from the free states of Achaia. And in all the provinces under his control he had forced the representatives of Roman financial companies to make large contributions to his funds. He had formed 9 legions of Roman citizens. 5 of these he had brought over with him from Italy. 1, a veteran legion, was from Cilicia and was known as the Twin, since it was made up of 2 legions. 1 was formed from veterans who had been discharged by their former commanders and had settled in Crete and Macedonia, and 2 came from Asia, where they had been recruited by the consul Lentulus. Included in these legions were a number of supplementary troops from Thessaly, Boeotia, Achaia, and Epirus, and also some who had previously served with Gaius Antonius. In addition to these 9 legions, he was expecting 2 more to be brought from Syria by Scipio. From Crete, Sparta, Pontus, Syria, and the other states, he had raised 3,000 archers, 2 cohorts of slingers, each of 600 men, and 7,000 cavalry. The cavalry consisted of 600 men from Gaul brought by Diotarus, and 500 from Cappadocia by Ariobarzanes. From Thrace, Cotys had sent the same number with his son Sadala. 200 had come from Macedonia under the command of Rhascipolis, a most able and distinguished soldier. From Alexandria, Pompey's son had brought aboard his fleet 500 Gauls and Germans whom Aulus Gabinius had left there as a bodyguard for King Ptolemy. 800 had been raised from Pompey's own slaves and herdsmen. Tarquindarius Castor and Domnelaus had provided 300 from Gallo-Graecia. One of these came personally with his men, and the other sent his son. 200, among whom were many mounted archers, had been sent from Syria by Antiochus of Commagene, who was lavishly rewarded by Pompey, and the number, as mentioned above, was made up with Dardani and Basi, some serving as mercenaries, some secured by Pompey's name or authority, Macedonians, Thessalians, and others. He had collected enormous quantities of grain from Thessaly, Asia, Egypt, Crete, Cyrene, and other areas. He had decided to spend the winter at Durazzo, Apollonia, and other towns on the sea, in order to prevent me from crossing. With the same end in view, he had stationed units of his fleet all along the coast. Young Pompey was in command of the Egyptian ships, Decimus Laelius and Gaius Triarius of the Asiatic contingent. The Syrians were commanded by Gaius Cassius, the Rhodians by Gaius Marcellus, acting together with Gaius Coponius. The Liburnian and Achaean fleet was under Scribonius Libo and Marcus Octavius. But the supreme commander by sea, who had final authority over all naval dispositions, was Marcus Bibulus. The landing in Illyrium and first moves. As soon as I reached Brindisi, I addressed the troops. I told them that since we were now nearing the end of our difficulties and dangers, they must not mind leaving their slaves and heavy baggage behind, and going aboard themselves as lightly equipped as possible, so that we could embark all the more men. As for the future, once we had won, they could rely on my generosity. The men all broke into cheering, and told me to give them whatever orders I liked. They would gladly do whatever they were asked. So we put to sea on January the 4th. 7 legions, as already explained, were on board. Next day we reached land and found a quiet anchorage between the Ceraunian rocks and other dangerous parts of the coast. I avoided all regular harbours, assuming them to be occupied by the enemy, and disembarked at a place called Pyleste, without a single ship's being damaged. Lucretius Vespillo and Minucius Rufus were at Paleocastro with 18 of the Asiatic ships. They had been given this force by Laelius. Bibulus was at Corfu with 110 ships, but Vespillo and Rufus were so unsure of themselves that they did not venture out of the harbour, even though we had only 12 warships in all, including 4 decked ships, to protect the convoy. And Bibulus was too late on the scene. His ships were not ready for action, and his rowers were not on the spot, because our fleet was actually sighted off the mainland before any rumour of our arrival reached that area. When the troops had landed, I sent the ships back to Brindisi on the same night, so that the other legions and the cavalry could be brought across. One of my officers, Fufius Calenus, was put in charge of this operation, with orders to carry it out as quickly as possible. But the ships were late in getting out to sea, missed the night breeze, and ran into serious trouble on this return voyage. Bibulus had got news at Corfu that I was arriving, and still hoped that he might intercept some of the transports while they were loaded. As it was, he intercepted some of them after they had already landed the troops and got about 30 of them into his power. On these ships he vented the anger and shame which he felt at the thought of his own inefficiency. He burned all of them, captains and crews together with the vessels, hoping that this savage punishment would have the effect of discouraging the rest. Next he occupied with his fleet every harbour and anchorage the whole way along the coast from Sassano to Veglia. Patrols were carefully organized, and he himself spent the nights aboard, though the weather was bad, showing himself ready to undertake any task or difficulty, with or without help, so long as he could get to grips with me. After the Liburnian fleet had left Illyrium, Marcus Octavius came to Saloni with the ships under his command. There he carried on agitation among the Dalmatians and other native tribes, and induced the town of Vis to go over from my side to that of Pompey. At Saloni, neither his promises nor his threats had any effect on the town council, so he decided to attack the place. The town was well protected by its positions on a hill, and the Roman citizens there rapidly built wooden towers to reinforce the defence. Resistance was difficult, however, because of their small numbers, and after many of them had been wounded, they resorted to extreme measures. They freed all their slaves of military age and cut off the hair of all the women, using it for the making of catapult ropes. Seeing how determined they were, Octavius built 5 camps all around the town, bringing pressure to bear on the inhabitants both by siege works and by assaults. The defenders were ready to endure anything, but were in great difficulties over their grain supply. They sent a deputation to me to ask for my help in this respect, being prepared to put up with all the other hardships by themselves. And after a long time had passed, and the very length of the siege had made Octavius's men somewhat careless, the defenders, taking their chance at midday when the enemy had withdrawn, first stationed the boys and women on the walls, so that everything should look as usual, and then all together in one body, both the citizens and the recently freed slaves, burst into the nearest of Octavius's camps and took it by storm. They went straight on to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and finally the 5th, drove the men out of each camp, killed many of them, and forced Octavius with the survivors to fly to their ships. So ended the attempted siege. By now winter was approaching, and Octavius, after the great losses he had suffered, despaired of taking Saloni, and retired to join Pompey at Durazzo. It has already been mentioned that Pompey's chief engineer, Lucius Vibullius Rufus, had twice fallen into my hands, and had twice been set free, once at Corpinium, and again in Spain. In view of the fact that I had treated him so well, I thought he would be the right person to send with a letter to Pompey, with whom I knew also that he had considerable influence. The following is a summary of what I wrote. We should, both of us, adopt a less obstinate attitude. Could we not both lay down our arms and tempt fortune no further? We have both suffered heavily already, and these losses should be enough to serve as a lesson to us and make us wish to avoid more misfortune in future. You have been driven from Italy and lost Sicily, Sardinia, the 2 Spanish provinces, and 130 cohorts of Roman citizens in Italy and Spain. I, on my side, have had Curio killed, a great army in Africa annihilated, and other troops forced to surrender at Veglia. Thus we have had enough experience to teach us how great is the elements of chance in war. Should we not try to preserve both ourselves and our country? And now is the one time when we can talk about peace, when each of us is confident in himself, and both of us appear evenly matched. If we wait until chance gives one of us some slight advantage, then the one who thinks he is on top will not consider terms of compromise. He will refuse a fair share once he believes that he is going to get everything. Now, since we have failed to come to any agreement previously, the terms of peace should be referred to the Senate and people in Rome. Meanwhile, we should have acted in accordance with our own interests and those of the state, if we were both publicly to swear an oath to disband our armies within the next 3 days. If we laid down our arms and gave up the forces on which we now relied, we should each necessarily have to be contented with the decision of the Senate and the Roman people. So that Pompey might be induced to agree with these proposals, I promised to disband all my land forces. This was the message which Vibullius received from me. He decided that before Pompey should begin discussing it, it was just as important that he should be informed of my sudden arrival, so that he could take steps to deal with that. And so he travelled night and day, without stop, changing horses at every town, so as to get to Pompey as fast as possible and tell him of my approach. Pompey was at that time at Candabium, on his way from Macedonia to winter quarters at Apollonia and Durazzo. He was much alarmed at the news, and pushed on by forced marches to Apollonia in order to prevent us from occupying the towns along the coast. As it happened, as soon as the troops were landed, I set out on the same day for Paleocastro. Lucius Torquatus, with a garrison of Partheni, had been put in command of this place, and when he arrived he had the gates shut, and attempted to defend the town. But when he ordered the Greek troops to take up arms and man the walls, they refused to fight against one who had held an official command from the Roman people. The townsmen also took their own measures to admit me. Since there was no hope of help from elsewhere, Torquatus opened the gates and surrendered. I saw that he was kept safe and uninjured. As soon as we had occupied Paleocastro, we made straight for Apollonia. Here Lucius Stiberius was in command. When he heard of our approach, he began to fortify the citadel, to fill up the water supply there, and to collect hostages from the citizens. The citizens, however, refused to give hostages. They said that they would not shut their gates against one who was a consul, or take up a line that was different from that adopted by the whole of Italy and by the Roman people. Finding that this was the way they felt, Stiberius fled secretly from Apollonia. The citizens then sent a deputation to me and admitted me into this town. Their example was followed by Bilis, Amantia, and other places in the neighborhood, and all Epirus. Deputations kept on arriving to promise obedience to my orders. When Pompey heard what had happened at Paleocastro and Apollonia, he feared for the safety of Durazzo, and made all haste to get there, marching by night and day. Just then a rumor got about that my troops were approaching. Pompey, in his hurry, had been turning night into day, and there was now such a panic in his army that all the men from Epirus and the districts near Epirus deserted, many of them throwing away their arms, and the march became more like a rout. Finally, Pompey halted near Durazzo, and ordered the ground to be measured out for his camp. Even now the army was still terrified, but Labienus took the initiative in coming forward, and swearing an oath that he would not desert Pompey, and would accept the same lot as fortune gave him, whatever it might be. The other senior officers took the same oath. They were followed by the rest of the officers, the centurions, and every man in the army. Finding that Pompey had got ahead of me on the way to Durazzo, I made no further attempt to press on. I pitched a camp on the river Seman, not far from Apollonia, in order to protect the states that had come over so loyally to my side. I decided to wait here for the arrival of the other legions from Italy, and to spend the winter in our tents. Pompey did likewise, and pitched his camp on the other side of the Seman, bringing into it all his forces and auxiliaries. Meanwhile, Calenus had followed out my instructions. He had embarked at Brindisi all the legionaries and cavalry for whom he had shipping, and put out to sea. But after going a little way out of the harbour, he received a dispatch from me informing him that all ports and the entire coastline were patrolled by enemy fleets. On hearing this, he returned to harbour, and recalled all his ships. One of these, because it had no troops on board, and was sailing under private enterprise, disregarded Calenus's signal, and continued on her course toward Paleocastro. She was captured by Bibulus, who massacred every single person on board. Slaves, freedmen, even young boys. So the fate of the whole army was determined in a few seconds, and hung on one critical moment. Bibulus, as already mentioned, was at sea off Paleocastro with his fleet. He was certainly succeeded in cutting me off from the sea and from the harbour, but he was himself cut off from landing anywhere in those parts. I had patrols posted all along the shores, and he had no chance of getting wood or water from the land, or of mooring his ships close inshore. He was therefore in an extremely difficult position, suffering from the lack of all necessities, and was compelled to bring not only all normal supplies, but also wood and water from Corfu by merchant ship. There was even one occasion when, in very bad weather, They were forced to catch the night's dew in the skins with which the ships were covered. However, they bore all these hardships bravely and patiently enough, and were determined not to raise their blockade of the shores and the harbours. While they were experiencing all these difficulties, Libo joined Bibulus. One day, both of them from shipboard got in touch with two officers of mine, Marcus Acilius and Statius Murcus, one of whom was in command of the fortifications of Paleocastro, and the other of the detachments on shore. Libo and Bibulus declared that they wished, if the opportunity were given them, to confer with me on matters of the greatest importance, and they added a few words to strengthen the impression they had made that what they wanted was to talk about peace terms. Meanwhile, they asked for a truce, and this was granted. Acilius and Murcus considered that they really had something important to say. They knew that I was particularly anxious for peace, and it looked as though something had been gained by the message I had given to Vibullius. At this time I was at a town called Buthrotum, opposite Corfu. I had gone there with one legion to bring over to my side some of the more distant tribes, and to make arrangements for the supply of grain, which was becoming scarce. When I was informed in a letter from Acilius and Murcus about the request of Libo and Bibulus, I left the legion there and went back myself to Paleocastro. On arriving there, I invited Libo and Bibulus to a conference. Libo came and made excuses for the non-appearance of Bibulus, who was, he said, known for his extremely violent temper, and who had also a particular dislike for me, a feeling that dated back to the day that we had been aediles and praetors together. He had therefore absented himself from the conference, so that there should be no risk of his bad tempers interfering with a discussion on matters which promised so much good for the future. Libo then stated that he personally most earnestly desired, and always had desired, that a settlement should be reached, and that both sides should disband their armies. But he had no power in the matter at all, since, by the decision of their council, the whole conduct of the war was in the hands of Pompey. But if I would tell him what I wanted, he would pass on the information to Pompey, who would deal with the rest of the negotiations himself after listening to what Libo and Bibulus had to say. Until the messengers should return from Pompey, he proposed that the truce should remain in force, and that neither side should take action against the other. He concluded with a few words about the general issues involved, and about the forces at his disposal. I did not regard these remarks as being worth a reply at the time, and cannot now see any reason why they should be recorded. I asked to be allowed to send people of my own choice to deal with Pompey, and that Libo and Bibulus should either guarantee them a safe journey, or else should provide an escort. With regard to the question of the truce, I pointed out that each side at present had its own military advantage. They with their fleet were holding up my ships and my reinforcements. I was preventing them from landing and getting water. If they wanted concessions from me, then they must relax their naval blockade. If they maintained that, then I would maintain my position too. Nevertheless, I said, it was still possible to negotiate, even if none of these concessions were made. The absence of agreement here need not be an obstacle to a discussion of peace terms. Libo would neither escort my messengers nor guarantee them a safe conduct. He wanted to refer all this to Pompey. His one aim was to get a truce, and on this point he spoke with much eagerness. I realized that all this talk had been started merely because of their present difficulties, and as a means toward easing their situation with regard to supplies. No real prospect or proposal for peace was being offered at all. I therefore turned my attention again to military operations. Bibulus had been kept from land for many days, and as a result of the cold and of overwork, had fallen seriously ill. No medical attention was available, and since he refused to give up the task which he had undertaken, he lost strength and succumbed to his illness. After his death there was no longer any supreme naval commander-in-chief. Each admiral acted separately, and used his own fleet as he thought best. Now, Vibullius had waited until the commotion occasioned by my sudden landing had quieted down. Then, as soon as the moment seemed propitious, he opened the question of the proposals which I had delivered to him. He had with him Libo and Lucius Lucius, and Theophanes, all people with whom Pompey was in the habit of discussing matters of importance. But as soon as he began to speak, Pompey interrupted him, and told him to say no more. Neither life, he said, nor my rights as a citizen would be of any value to me at all if it were thought that I owed them to the kindness of Caesar, and no one could help thinking this if it were believed that I had been fetched back to Italy, where I left of my own accord, now that Caesar has finished his campaign. I heard this from people who were present at the conversation. Nevertheless, I still tried, by other means, to arrange for a peace conference. There was only the river Samon between my camp and Pompey's. The soldiers on each side often had talks together, and by mutual agreement no hostilities took place while these talks were going on. I sent one of my officers, Publius Vatinius, right down to the river bank to bring forward for discussion some of the most important points as regards peace. I instructed him to keep on shouting out, "Cannot citizens send representatives to their own fellow citizens to discuss peace? Even fugitives in the forests of the Pyrenees have been allowed to do this, and so have pirates. Why not citizens whose object is to put an end to fighting among citizens?" So he spoke at some length, adopting a humble manner as befitted one pleading for his own safety, and that of everyone else. The troops on both sides listened to him in silence. Then it was announced from the other side that Aulus Varro had agreed to come on the following day and join in discussions as to arranging safe conduct for a deputation and a proper opportunity for them to express their views. A definite time was fixed for this meeting. So on the next day great numbers of troops came together from both sides. There was a general feeling that something important was happening, and everyone's thoughts seemed turned toward peace. Then out of the middle of the crowd, Titus Labienus stepped forward. Instead of making any reference to peace, he began talking to Vatinius in the most abusive manner. This conversation was suddenly interrupted by a shower of spears and arrows coming from all quarters. Vatinius, protected by our soldiers' shields, got away safe, but a number of people were wounded, including Cornelius Balbus, Marcus Plotius, Lucius Tiburtius, and some centurions and soldiers. Labienus then shouted out, "This will show you that you can give up talking of peace. There can be no peace with us until Caesar's head is brought in." The Conspiracy of Caelius. In Rome, at about this time, the praetor Marcus Caelius Rufus took up the cause of the debtors. From the beginning of his period of office, he set up his tribunal next to that of the city praetor Gaius Trebonius, and announced that he was prepared to give assistance to anyone who appealed against the valuations and orders to pay fixed by the method of arbitration that I had devised when I was last in Rome. The method itself, however, was a fair one, and Trebonius applied it with great humanity, being of the opinion that in these difficult times the law should be administered with mercy and moderation. Thus no one could be found to come forward and appeal against it, for it is no doubt a normal enough thing to make the excuse of poverty, to complain of one's own hardships or the misfortunes of the times, or to point out how hard it is to get a good price for auctioned property. But it is downright effrontery to hold on to everything one possesses, and still admit that one is in debt. Consequently, no one could be found to make the application which Caelius wanted, and Caelius showed himself harsher in his manner than those whose personal interests were concerned in recovering their debts. Wishing to avoid giving the impression that he had not only taken on a bad cause, but failed to do anything with it, Caelius went on to propose a law providing that the payment of debts should be postponed for 6 years, and that during this period no interest was to be charged. The consul, Servilius, and the other magistrates opposed this proposal, and Caelius found himself less effective than he had expected. In order to excite opinion on his side, he withdrew his first proposal and put forward 2 new ones, one for abolishing all rents on houses and apartments for a year, and one for the cancellation of all debts. Riots took place in which many people were wounded, and Trebonius was driven from his tribunal. The consul Servilius reported the affair to the Senate, and the Senate voted that Caelius should be removed from office. In accordance with this decision, the consul refused to allow him to take his seat in the Senate, and when he tried to make a speech in public, had him removed from the platform. Caelius was deeply wounded by this humiliation, and in public gave out that he was going to report personally to me. Secretly, however, he sent agents to recall Milo, who had been in exile since being condemned for the murder of Clodius, and who, after the many gladiatorial shows which he had given, still had with him the remains of a whole training establishment for gladiators. Milo then joined Caelius, who sent him ahead to stir up trouble among the shepherds in the neighbourhood of Thurii. Caelius himself got as far as Casilinum, when, on the same day, Milo's standards and arms were seized at Capua, and the band of gladiators, whose job it was to betray the city, was seen at Naples. The plot was discovered, and Caelius was now shut out of Capua, where the Roman citizens of the place took up arms, and denounced him as a public enemy. Seeing the danger he was in, Caelius gave up his plan, and took another road. Meanwhile, Milo had written to the town councils claiming that what he was doing was by the orders and under the authority of Pompey, who had sent Vibullius to him with instructions. He attempted to win the support of all those whom he thought to be suffering from their debts, but had no success at all in this agitation. Then, after freeing a number of slaves from their barracks, he began to attack the town of Cosa, near Thurii, which was held by the praetor Quintus Pedius with 1 legion. Milo was killed by a stone thrown at him from the wall. As for Caelius, he got as far as Thurii, after having professed to be going to join me. Here he tried to intrigue with various townspeople and offered bribes to some of my own Spanish and Gallic cavalry who had been sent there to garrison the place. They killed him. So ended, quickly and easily, a dangerous revolutionary movement which was affecting the whole of Italy, and imposing a serious amount of labor on the government. Reinforcements arrived from Italy. Libo, meanwhile, with his fleet of 50 ships, had sailed from Paleocastro to Brindisi, and occupied an island lying off the harbour, his idea being that it was better to occupy one single position directly in the line that would have to be taken by our reinforcements than to keep up a blockade on all the harbours and the entire coastline. Since he arrived suddenly and unexpectedly, he intercepted some merchant ships, which he burned, except for 1 ship loaded with grain, which he towed away. This caused a good deal of panic among our men, and at night Libo landed some soldiers and archers and forced a cavalry outpost of ours to abandon its position. In fact, he made such good use of his opportunity that he wrote to Pompey to say that, if he liked, he could have his other ships drawn up on land for refitting. He himself, he said, with his own fleet, was quite capable of preventing any reinforcements from reaching me. At this time, Mark Antony was at Brindisi. He could count on the fighting quality of his troops, and so he put picked men aboard about 60 ships' rowing boats, which he had strengthened with screens of wickerwork, and stationed the boats separately at various points along the shore. He then ordered the 2 triremes which he had built for him at Brindisi to row out to the harbour mouth, ostensibly by way of exercising the crews. Libo, seeing them coming out so boldly, sent 4 quadriremes against them in the hope of intercepting them. When the enemy ships drew near, our veteran crews began to retire inside the harbour, and the enemy, elated by the pursuit, rashly followed them. Then, in a moment, the signal was given, and from every direction Antony's boats bore down upon the enemy. They immediately captured one of the quadriremes, complete with its rowers and fighting troops, and forced the rest to take to flight in the most disgraceful manner. To add to the enemy's discomfiture, Antony posted cavalry all along the shore to prevent them from getting water. So, what with his difficulties of supply and his bitter feelings occasioned by his ignominious defeat, Libo gave up the idea of blockading our men, and left Brindisi. Months passed, and winter was drawing to a close, but still no ships bringing the legions came to me from Brindisi. It seemed to me that a number of opportunities for sailing had been missed. There had often been a steady wind blowing, and on these occasions they ought unquestionably to have set out. As time went on, the enemy naval commanders became more and more efficient in guarding the coasts, and still more confident in their ability to stop reinforcements from arriving. Pompey had frequently written blaming them for not having prevented my landing in the first place, and telling them that at least they must prevent the arrival of the rest of the army. Also, since by now the winds were beginning to slacken, they assumed that it would be more difficult still to make the crossing. All this was very disturbing to me, and I wrote sharply to my officers at Brindisi, telling them that they must sail on the first occasion when the wind was suitable, either in the direction of Apollonia or of Scutari, at both of which it was possible to run the ships ashore. These places were not so much under enemy observation as others, since their fleets did not venture too far from their harbours. At Brindisi they now acted with daring and resolution. Mark Antony and Fufius Calenus were in charge of operations, and the soldiers backed them up enthusiastically, showing that they were willing to take any risk when my safety was at stake. They left Brindisi on a south wind, and next day were carried past Apollonia. Sighting them from the mainland, Coponius, the commander of the Rhodian fleet at Durazzo, sailed out of the harbour, and as the wind began to slacken, drew nearer and nearer our ships. The same south wind began to blow strongly again, and came to our rescue. Nevertheless, Coponius would not give up. He hoped that if his rowers stuck to it and gave their best, they could overcome the force of the gale, and though we were driven before the wind right past Durazzo, he kept at his pursuit. Our men had certainly enjoyed good luck, but were still afraid of being overtaken by him if the wind dropped. So, when they came to a harbour called Nymphaeum, about 3 miles beyond Lissus, they ran their ships in there, believing the threat of the storm was less than that of the enemy fleet. For this harbour, while protected from the southwest, was exposed to the south wind. As soon as they got inside, by an incredible stroke of luck, the south wind, which had been blowing for 2 days, veered round to the southwest. It was a remarkable example of how fortune can change in a moment. Our men, who a moment ago were fearing for their safety, were now perfectly secure in harbour, and the enemy, who just now were threatening to destroy us, found that they had cause to fear for themselves. So, as circumstances changed, the weather protected us, and at the same time caused such havoc among the Rhodian vessels that every one of them, 16 decked ships, were driven ashore and wrecked. Of the great numbers of rowers and regular troops on board, some were thrown up on the rocks and killed, and others were rescued by our men. I saw to it that these came to no harm and were allowed to return home. 2 of our ships, which had got behind the rest at nightfall, not knowing where the others had gone, dropped anchor off Lissus. Otacilius Crassus, in command at Lissus, took steps to seize them by sending out numbers of rowing boats and other small craft. At the same time, he tried to get the men on board to surrender, promising that they would come to no harm if they did so. Of these 2 ships, one had on board 220 men from a legion recently recruited, and the other rather less than 200 veterans. The sequel will show what a help it is to have a resolute and determined spirit. The recruits were terrified at the number of craft coming up, and were also in a bad state because of the rough sea and their seasickness. After receiving a guarantee that the enemy would do them no harm, they surrendered to Otacilius, who had them all brought before him, and then, in violation of the solemn pledge that he had given, had them cruelly killed in front of his eyes. The soldiers of the veteran legion, on the other hand, who had suffered just as much as the others from the storm and the filthy bilge-water, remembered their long record of valour and determined to live up to it. They spun out the first part of the night in discussing terms of a possible surrender, then made the pilot run the ship ashore, found a good position, and passed the rest of the night there. At dawn, Otacilius sent out against them about 400 cavalry, who were guarding that part of the coast, and some armed detachments from the town garrison. But the veterans beat off the attack, and after killing a number of the enemy, retired without loss, and joined up with our main body of troops. After this, the Roman community at Lissus, it was a community that I had established there myself and fortified some years previously, opened the gates of the town to Antony and gave him every possible assistance. Otacilius, fearing for his life, fled and went to Pompey. Antony disembarked his complete force, which consisted of 3 veteran legions, 1 of recruits, and 800 cavalry. He sent most of the ships back to Italy to transport the rest of the infantry and cavalry, but kept at Lissus the boats he had, which were of the Gallic type, called pontoons. This was so that I should have some means of pursuit if, as many people thought likely, Pompey considered Italy to be unguarded and took his own army there. Antony immediately informed me by messenger of where he had landed and in what strength. Both Pompey and I heard of Antony's arrival at about the same time. The ships had been seen passing Apollonia and Durazzo, but for a day or 2 no one knew how far they had been carried up the coast. When we did know what had happened, we both acted with different aims in view. My aim being to join forces with Antony as soon as possible, and Pompey's to intercept him on the route, and, if possible, to catch him in an ambush. We left our winter camps on the Seman within 12 hours of each other. Pompey led his army away quietly by night. I went openly by day, but I had the longer route, since I had to make a detour and go upstream to find a ford. Pompey had no river to cross, and so could travel more quickly. He hurried by forced marches toward Antony until he received information that Antony was quite close. Then he chose a good place for his purpose, kept all his troops in camp, and forbade them to light any fires in the hope that his presence would not be detected. But all this was immediately reported to Antony by the Greeks of the neighborhood. Antony sent word to me of what the position was, and kept his men in camp for 1 day. Next day I joined him. When Pompey heard that I had arrived, he withdrew in order to avoid being caught between 2 armies, and marched in full strength to Asparagium, near Durazzo, where he chose a good position and pitched camp. Scipio in Asia and Macedonia. During this time, Scipio had been in the east. After suffering considerable losses near Mount Amanus, he had adopted the title of Imperator. He went on to demand great sums of money from the various states and local rulers, and also exacted from the Roman taxation officers not only the amount of tax owing for the last 2 years, but also a loan of the money that would become due next year. He also ordered cavalry to be recruited throughout the province. When this had been done, he moved with his entire infantry and cavalry force out of Syria, leaving behind him on the frontier those enemy forces of Parthians who had recently killed our general Marcus Crassus, and had besieged Bibulus. This action of his caused great anxiety among the Syrians, who feared an attack from Parthia, and Scipio's own soldiers were heard saying that they would follow him if they were led against the enemy, but would not fight against one who was a fellow citizen and a consul. Scipio then led his troops into winter quarters in Pergamum and the richest cities of Asia, made lavish gifts to the soldiers, and in order to secure their loyalty gave them a free hand to plunder the provincial communities. Meanwhile, the money that had been so ruthlessly demanded was being brought in from all parts of the province. Many entirely new means of extortion were discovered to minister to his avarice. A poll tax was imposed on all slaves and children. Taxes were also levied on pillars, doors, grain, soldiers, arms, rowers, pieces of artillery, carriages. In fact, anything for which a name could be found was regarded as a source of tax. Officials with military power behind them were to be found everywhere, not only in charge of cities, but in practically every village or isolated post, and among these officials, those who excelled the rest in cruelty and hard-heartedness were regarded as real men and true patriots. The whole province was overrun with officials and commissioners, crammed with organizers and collectors, all of whom were interested not only in raising the sums required by the government, but also in making a good thing of it for themselves. They gave out that they were in the position of exiles from home and fatherland, consequently in need even of the necessities of life, and so found a plausible pretext for their thoroughly disgraceful behavior. In addition to all this, there were very high rates of interest, as usually happens in war when money is levied from the whole population, and to postpone the date of payment was called a free gift. So in these 2 years the indebtedness of the province was more than doubled. Nevertheless, the Roman citizens in the province still had to pay various taxes which were levied on them, not as individuals, but as corporations or communities. These exactions were described as loans, and were said to be made in accordance with a decree of the Senate. And, as had been done in Syria, the tax collectors were required to produce the tax not only for the current year, but also for the year following. At Ephesus, Scipio ordered the removal from the temple of Diana of the money which, from very ancient times, had been deposited there. A day was fixed for this operation, and those who were to remove the treasure, accompanied by several people of senatorial rank invited by Scipio, had arrived at the shrine when Scipio was handed a dispatch from Pompey, informing him that I had crossed the Adriatic with my legions, and instructing him to postpone all other business and to hurry back to join him. As soon as he had read the dispatch, Scipio dismissed those who had come to the temple, and began to make preparations for marching into Macedonia. Within a few days he was on his way, and the temple treasure at Ephesus was saved. After I had joined forces with Antony, I recalled from Paleocastro the legion that I had left there to guard the coast, and proceeded to march inland with the purpose of winning the provinces over to my side. Deputations reached me from Thessaly and from Aetolia, and I was promised that the states in those areas would join me if I sent troops to protect them. I sent to Thessaly Lucius Cassius Longinus with the 27th Legion, made up of recruits, and 200 cavalry, and to Aetolia I sent Gaius Calvisius Sabinus, with 5 cohorts and a small cavalry force. As these districts were quite close, I gave them special instructions to arrange for the grain supply. I ordered Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus to march into Macedonia with 2 legions, the 11th and 12th, and 500 cavalry. From the part of Macedonia called Free came Menedemus, the leading man in that area, and assured him that his people were all enthusiastically on our side. These officers fared as follows. Calvisius was welcomed by the whole population of Aetolia as soon as he arrived. He drove the enemy garrisons out of Calydon and Lepanto, and gained control of the whole area. Cassius, on reaching Thessaly with his legion, found that the country was split up into two parties, and so met with a reception that varied from place to place. The parties were led by Hegesaritus and Patrius. Hegesaritus had been for a long time a person of importance in Thessaly, and was on Pompey's side. Patrius, a young man from one of the best families, supported me with all the resources that he had. Domitius, at the same time, reached Macedonia. Numerous deputations from the various states had begun to come to him, when it was suddenly reported that Scipio with his legions was close at hand. There were all sorts of stories and rumors, as normally happens in an unexpected situation when everything is exaggerated before the facts are known. Scipio, as it happened, wasted no time anywhere in Macedonia. He marched rapidly toward Domitius, and then suddenly, when he was about 20 miles away, turned aside toward Cassius Longinus in Thessaly. He moved so quickly that the news of his arrival came at the same time as the news of his approach. To ensure speed on the march, he had left Marcus Favonius with 8 cohorts to guard the baggage of the legions at a point on the river Aliacmon, the boundary between Macedonia and Thessaly, and had ordered him to build a fort there. At the same time, the cavalry of King Cotys, which was normally stationed along the Thessalian frontier, came riding up in force to Cassius's camp. Cassius, terrified by the arrival of Scipio, which had been reported, and by the sight of this cavalry, which he assumed to be Scipio's, marched into the mountains that surround Thessaly, and began to make his way toward Ambracia. Scipio hurried after him in pursuit, but was overtaken by messengers from Favonius, who told him that Domitius was approaching with his legions, and that, without the help of Scipio, Favonius could not hold the position where he had been posted. On reading this news, Scipio changed his plan, and altered the direction of his march. He gave up the pursuit of Cassius, and hurried to relieve Favonius. Marching both by day and by night, he arrived in the nick of time, while the dust cloud raised by Domitius's army and his own advance guards became visible to Favonius at the same moment. So Cassius was saved by the energy of Domitius, and Favonius by the quick response of Scipio. Scipio halted for 2 days in his camp on the river Aliacmon, which flowed between him and Domitius's camp. At dawn on the 3rd day, he brought his army across the river by the ford, built a camp, and early on the next day drew up his forces in front of it. Domitius then considered that the time had come for him to lead out his own forces, and to show that he had no hesitation about offering battle. There was a plain stretching for about 2 miles between the two camps, and Domitius brought his men across the plain and close to the enemy camp. But Scipio would not move far from his own rampart. Domitius had some difficulty in holding his men back. Nevertheless, it so happened that no battle took place, largely because below Scipio's camp there was a stream with steep banks which prevented our men from advancing farther. Scipio, however, had observed the spirit of our men, and how eager they were to fight. He thought it likely that on the following day he would either be forced to give battle against his will, or else keep his troops in camp. A very inglorious thing to do after all the high hopes which his appearance had roused. Indeed, his rash advance now ended in a discreditable withdrawal. He crossed the river under cover of night without even giving the signal for striking camp, and went back again to the place from which he had started. There he built a camp on high ground near the river. A few days later he set an ambush of cavalry by night in the area where for the last few days our men had been in the habit of foraging. When Quintus Varus, Domitius's cavalry commander, came with his men as usual, Scipio's cavalry rushed out on them from their ambush, but our men stood up well to the attack. They quickly formed up in their proper order, and then, in a compact body, took the offensive themselves. They killed about 80 of the enemy, put the rest to flight, and returned to camp with the loss of only 2 men. After this, Domitius, hoping to be able to entice Scipio into a position where he would have to fight, pretended that he was being forced to withdraw because of shortage of supplies. The usual signal for striking camp was given. Then, after marching for 3 miles, he halted in a good position with all of his infantry and cavalry out of sight of the enemy. Scipio prepared to follow him, but first sent out most of his cavalry to explore the route and find out where Domitius was. As they went forward, their first squadrons rode right into the ambush, but they became suspicious when they heard the neighing of horses and started to withdraw again. Those behind, seeing how fast they were retiring, halted. Our men realized that the ambush was discovered, and that there was no point in waiting for the main body to enter it. But they succeeded in cutting off 2 of the enemy squadrons, among whom was Marcus Opimius, Scipio's cavalry commander. Opimius managed to escape, but the rest were either killed or brought to Domitius as prisoners. The main front at Durazzo. After withdrawing the legion from its work in coastal defense, as explained above, I left 3 cohorts at Paleocastro to defend the town and to guard the warships which I had brought over from Italy. I made one of my officers, Achilles Caninus, responsible for both the town and the ships. He brought the ships into the inner harbor behind the town, moored them to the shore, and blocked the mouth of the harbor by sinking a merchant ship there. He put another ship alongside this merchant ship and anchored it in the middle of the channel. A tower was built on it, and it was manned by a detachment of troops ready to defend it in any emergency. Pompey's son, Aeneas, who was in command of the Egyptian fleet, heard of what was being done, and sailed to Paleocastro. With the aid of a wench and numerous ropes, he managed to hoist up to the surface the ship that had been sunk, and then attacked the guard ship with a number of ships of his own which had been equipped with high turrets. He was thus able to fire down on our men from above, and he could always replace his own men when they got tired by sending in fresh units. At the same time, he kept our forces divided by making attacks in other directions, assaulting the town walls, both from the sea with his fleet, and from the land by troops with scaling ladders. So by continuous effort on the part of the enemy, and an unceasing rain of missiles, our men were overwhelmed and driven out of the guard ship, which was captured, though all the defenders got away safely in small boats. At the same time, Aeneas seized the natural breakwater at the other side of the harbour, which forms the peninsula on which the town stands. From here he got 4 triremes across into the inner harbour by placing rollers underneath them, and pushing them forward by levers. So our warships, empty and moored to the shore, were attacked from 2 sides. 4 were dragged off and the rest burned. After the action was over, Decius Laelius, an officer from the Asiatic fleet, was left behind, and stopped any supplies from reaching Paleocastro from Bilis and Amantia. Aeneas Pompey himself then went on to Lissus, where he attacked and burned 13 merchant ships that had been left behind in the harbour by Antony. He attempted to storm Lissus itself, but the town was defended by the citizens of the Roman community there, and by the troops whom I had left as garrison. He stayed for 3 days, and after losing a few men in his attacks on the town, sailed away without having achieved his object. I myself marched toward Asparagium as soon as I found out that that was where Pompey was. On the way, we took by storm a town of the Partheni, in which Pompey had placed a garrison. 2 days later, I reached Pompey's position and camped near him. Next day, I brought the whole army out in battle order, and gave him the opportunity to fight. When I saw that he was staying where he was, I led my men back to camp, realizing that I should have to form some other plan. On the following day, I set out in full force for Durazzo, making a long detour by difficult and narrow roads. I hoped that Pompey would either be forced to make for Durazzo also, or else might be cut off from the place which was his main base for supplies and military equipment. And this, in fact, was what happened. At first he did not realize what my plan was, because he saw us marching off in the opposite direction, and imagined that we had been compelled to withdraw because of shortage of food. Later, however, his scouts informed him of our actual position, and on the next day he also struck camp, hoping to be able to get ahead of us by a shorter route. This was what I expected would happen, and I addressed the soldiers, asking them to bear cheerfully the exertion which I was demanding from them. So after only a few hours' rest that night, we reached Durazzo early in the morning and pitched camp there, just at the time that the vanguard of Pompey's army came into sight in the distance. Pompey, cut off from Durazzo, had failed to achieve his original purpose. He now adopted another plan and fortified a camp at a place called Petra, which stands on high ground, below which is a reasonably good harbour, sheltered from certain winds. He ordered some of his warships to sail in here, and grain and other supplies to be brought in from Asia and all other areas under his control. It now seemed to me likely that the campaign was going to be a long one. I had no hope of getting supplies from Italy because the whole coast was closely blockaded by Pompey's fleet, and my own fleets, which were being built in Sicily, Gaul, and Italy, were still not ready. So I sent two of my officers, Quintus Tillius and Lucius Cornelius, into Epirus to requisition food. As Epirus was a considerable distance away, I established granaries at various points and ordered the local communities to furnish carts for the transport of grain to these places. I also ordered a collection of all the grain that could be found at Lissus, among the Partheni, and in all fortified settlements. Only a very little was found, partly because of the nature of the country, which is wild and mountainous, so that, as a rule, the people live on grain imported from elsewhere, partly because Pompey had forestalled me. Some days earlier, his cavalry had plundered the whole district of the Partheni, had broken into and dug up the floors of their houses, and then carried off to Petra all the grain that had been discovered. So after I had found out how matters stood, I adopted a plan that was based on the nature of the ground in front of me. All around Pompey's camp were a number of steep hills, rising to considerable heights. First I occupied these hills with garrisons and built forts on them. Then, proceeding in each case according to the lay of the land, we built earthworks connecting the forts together, and so began to enclose Pompey behind lines of circumvallation. In making this plan I was actuated by the following considerations. As we were short of food, and Pompey was particularly strong in cavalry, I wanted to be able to minimize the risk of bringing in grain and stores for my army from all directions. Secondly, I aimed at preventing Pompey from foraging, and so at making his cavalry useless for active operations. And thirdly, I wanted to strike a blow at Pompey's prestige, which was what he seemed chiefly to rely upon in his relations with foreign powers. This would be diminished when it became known throughout the world that he was being blockaded by me, and did not dare to risk fighting a pitched battle. Pompey was unwilling to move away from Durazzo and the sea. All his war material, weapons, armor, artillery, was stored at Durazzo, and the grain supply for the army was coming in by sea. He could only stop the building of my lines by fighting a battle, and he had decided that this was not the moment for fighting. There was therefore only one course left to him, and that was to push the strategy initiated by me to its extreme, to occupy himself as many hills as possible, to hold as much ground as possible with his own garrisons, and so to make me extend my forces over the widest possible area. This, in fact, was what he did. On a circuit of 14 miles, he built 24 forts, and inside this space could forage safely. It also contained a large area of crops, which could be used for feeding the animals when no foraging expedition was being made. Thus, just as our men were building lines of fortifications to prevent Pompey's soldiers from breaking through and attacking them in the rear, So Pompey's men were making their own inner ring of fortifications to stop us from breaking into it at any point and taking them in the rear. But they were the first to finish this operation, because they had more men working on it, and because, being on the inside, they had a smaller circuit to complete. Although Pompey had decided not to bring his whole force into action against us, and not to fight a pitched battle, nevertheless, whenever we had to occupy a position, he always sent up slingers and archers, of whom he had a great number, to attack us from positions of his own choice. Many of our men were wounded, and there was a general terror of the arrows. To protect themselves against these and other missiles, most of the soldiers equipped themselves with tunics or paddings of felt, quilting, or hides. Each side did its utmost in the struggle for seizing these positions for defense. My aim was to pen Pompey in as small an area as possible, while he wanted to seize as many heights as he could, and so widen the circuit of his defense works. There was consequently a good deal of fighting. On one occasion, a legion of mine, the 9th, had occupied a position, and was beginning to fortify it, when Pompey seized another hill close by, and straight in front of us. From here he proceeded to harass our men while they were working. From one side, our position could be approached on practically level ground, and here Pompey first threw out a screen of archers and slingers, then sent up a great number of light-armed troops, and brought forward his artillery. He was thus able to stop our men from working, since it was not easy for them to build fortifications and defend themselves at the same time. I saw our men being shot at and wounded from all sides, and ordered them to leave the position and retire. Their way back was downhill, and the enemy now pressed on all the more eagerly, hindering our retreat, since they imagined that we were being driven from the position in a panic. It was at this point that Pompey is said to have boasted to his friends, "If Caesar's legions get out of this without heavy losses, you can tell me that I know nothing about generalship. It was foolhardy of them to have put themselves into such a position." I had some apprehensions about the men's retreat, and ordered hurdles to be carried up to the farthest point on the slope, and to be fixed facing the enemy. Under cover of these, the soldiers were to dig a trench of moderate width, and to put as many obstacles as possible in the enemy's way. I then posted slingers in a suitable position for covering our men's retreat, and when all these preparations were completed, gave orders for the legion to be withdrawn. At this the enemy showed all the more contempt for us, and pressed on all the more confidently. They tore down the hurdles that had been fixed across their path, and went on to cross the trenches. On observing this, I feared that we might suffer worse losses if it appeared that we were being driven from our position, instead of making a voluntary withdrawal. The legion was now about halfway down the slope, and I instructed Antony, who was in command, to have the trumpet sounded, and give the order to charge. The soldiers of the 9th immediately pulled themselves together, hurled their javelins, and started from lower ground, broke into the double, charged uphill, and drove the Pompeians before them in a headlong flight. The enemy's retreat was considerably hindered by the overturned hurdles, the uprights sticking in the ground, and the lines of trenches. Our men, however, were satisfied with being able to retire without serious losses. A number of the enemy had been killed, and their own losses were only 5 men all told. So they withdrew at their leisure, and after occupying some other hills rather nearer our lines, brought them into the system of our fortifications. This was an altogether new type of warfare. The great numbers of forts, the extent of ground covered, the size of the fortifications, and the whole system of blockade were unprecedented, and there were all sorts of other unusual conditions as well. Normally, when one army blockades another, it is attacking an enemy who is weakened or demoralized, who has been conquered in battle or is suffering from the effects of some failure or other. The blockading army is numerically superior in infantry and cavalry, and the whole idea of the blockade is to prevent the enemy from getting supplies. But now I was in the inferior position numerically, and was blockading an army that was undefeated and had not yet even been engaged. Moreover, they had plenty of everything. Every day great numbers of ships arrived to bring them supplies. In fact, From whatever direction the wind blew, it would be favorable for some of these ships. We, on the other hand, had used up all the grain from all areas available to us, and were now in considerable difficulties. Nevertheless, the men endured these hardships with remarkable patience. They remembered that last year they had suffered the same hardships in Spain, and because of their endurance and hard work, had been totally victorious in a great war. They could remember, too, how short they had been of supplies at Alesia, and the even more serious famine at Bourges. Yet in these cases the campaigns had ended in the defeat of the most powerful nations in Gaul. So now, when they were issued barley or vegetables, they made no complaints, and they were actually extremely pleased to get meat, with which they could be supplied plentifully from Epirus. Some of the men, when off duty, had discovered a kind of root called chara, which, when mixed with milk, was a useful supplement to their rations. There was plenty of it, and they made a sort of bread out of it. When Pompey's soldiers mocked our men for being half-starved, they retaliated by throwing some of these loaves over into the enemy lines to show them that there was no reason for them to feel so confident. And by now, too, the grain was beginning to ripen. The men were confident that they would soon have plenty, and hopes for the future made the present shortage easier to bear. One often heard the soldiers, whether on guard or talking among themselves, say that they would rather live on the bark of trees than let Pompey slip through their hands. They were cheered, too, by hearing from deserters that, though the enemy's cavalry horses were being kept alive, all their baggage animals had died, and that the troops themselves were in a bad state of health as a result of cramped quarters, the stench of vast numbers of corpses, and the continual hard work to which they were unused. They were also extremely short of water. All the rivers and streams flowing into the sea had either been diverted by us or else dammed up by engineering works on a large scale. It is rough, mountainous country, and we blocked up the narrow river valleys by sinking piles into the ground, which made a framework for the banked-up earth that was to dam the water. So the enemy were forced to keep to the low-lying marshy ground, and to dig wells there, which gave them still more work to do. Moreover, these springs were sometimes at a considerable distance from the forts, and were apt to dry up quickly in the hot weather. My army, on the other hand, enjoyed excellent health. We had plenty of water, and indeed of everything else except grain, and as the troops saw the grain steadily growing ripe, they could tell that here, too, prospects were daily improving. In this new type of warfare, new tactics were evolved by both sides. The enemy, for example, had observed from the watchfires that our men were sleeping out at night by the entrenchments. So they would creep up silently, in a body, shoot their arrows into the general mass, and quickly retire to their own lines. Taught by experience, our men found ways of dealing with this form of attack, lighting fires in one place. Translator's note. Here there is a considerable break in the manuscripts. From Appian, it may be inferred that the missing passage described an unsuccessful attack on Durazzo by Caesar, and an attack on Caesar's lines made by Pompey. The text begins again with an account of how this attack of Pompey's was beaten off. When I left, I had put Publius Sulla in charge of the camp. He was informed of the situation, and came to the cohort's relief with 2 legions. As soon as he arrived, Pompey's troops were easily driven back. The sight of our men was enough for them, and they made no resistance to our attack. Once the first of them had given way, the rest turned and fled from the position they had occupied. Our men pursued them, but Sulla recalled them in case they should go too far. Many people think that if he had followed them up with more energy, the war could have been won on that day. But personally, I do not think he can be blamed for the decision he made. The duties of a deputy commander and of a commander-in-chief are quite different. One should act entirely in accordance with his instructions, whereas the other is free to make important decisions on his own when the situation demands them. Sulla had been left in charge of the camp by me. He had rescued some of his men from a difficult position, and was content with that. Not wishing to assume the functions of a commander-in-chief, he did not choose to fight a pitched battle which could conceivably have gone against him. Pompey's men were now in a position from which it was not easy for them to withdraw. They had advanced from low ground to the top of a hill, and in retiring down the slope they were afraid of the attacks launched by our men from above. Also, there was not much daylight left. In their confidence of winning a complete success, they had prolonged the action almost until nightfall. Pompey was therefore forced to adapt his actions to the circumstances. He occupied a hill which was far enough from our fort to be out of range of our artillery, and fortified this position after bringing all his forces to it. There was also fighting going on at two other points during this time. Pompey had attacked several of our forts simultaneously, with the idea of keeping our forces equally divided, so that one garrison should not be able to come and give help to the next. In one place, Volcasius Tullus, with 3 cohorts, stood up to an attack launched by a whole legion. In another, our Germans sallied out from the lines, and returned again without loss after killing considerable numbers of the enemy. So 6 battles were fought on one day, 3 at Durazzo and 3 at various points along our fortifications. On reckoning everything up, we found that Pompey had lost about 2,000 men, including a number of veterans and centurions. Among these was Valerius Flaccus, son of the Lucius Flaccus, who had governed Asia as praetor. 6 of their standards were captured. On our side there were not more than 20 missing after all these engagements. But in the fighting at the fort, every single one of our men was wounded, and 4 centurions out of 1 cohort lost their eyes. Wanting to give me some proof of the trouble and danger that they had been in, they showed me, properly counted, about 30,000 arrows that had been shot into the fort, and they brought me a shield belonging to the centurion Sceva, which had 120 weapon holes in it. It was clear that it was largely owing to Sceva that the fort had been saved, and for his services to me and to the state, I granted him 200,000 sesterces, publicly congratulated him, and promoted him from the 8th cohort to the position of 1st centurion of the 1st cohort. Later, I gave full recognition to the cohort as a whole, presenting the men with double pay, decorations, and free issues of grain and clothing. During the night, Pompey built new and stronger defense works, and in the next few days erected towers, raised the height of his fortifications to 15 feet, and placed screens along the top. 5 days later he took advantage of a cloudy night, barricaded all the gates, fixed stakes in the ground to hold up any pursuit, and soon after midnight led his forces quietly out of camp, and retired to the fortifications which they had held previously. Every day after this I drew up my army on level ground, and gave Pompey an opportunity to fight. I brought the legions up quite close to his camp. In fact, my front line was only just out of range of artillery planted on his rampart. Pompey also, in order to safeguard his name and reputation, drew his army up in battle order in front of his camp, but so close to it that his 3rd line was practically touching the rampart, and the whole army was sheltered by his artillery.